Touched by Tony Angelo. The Parisian summer shimmered, a deceptive veil of romance over the furnace of ambition. At the hallowed ancient stones of the École des Beaux-Arts, the air was thick with the scent of turpentine, old canvas, and an unspoken desperation. This was the Renoir Studio Intensive, a coveted summer internship designed to sift the promising from the truly exceptional. A direct pipeline for the most prestigious art programs across the globe, not least among them the fabled Greenwich Academy of Fine Arts, GAFA, the Ivy League of the art world. Among the cohort of 20 young artists, 3 stood in a peculiar alignment, defined not by their individual merits, though those were considerable, but by an external gaze that saw them as one. There was Aisha, her very presence a testament to defiance. Her slender frame, clad in worn jeans and a paint-splattered hoodie, belied the fierce energy that pulsed in her street art, a language forged in the rough edges of the banlieues where she'd grown up. Her family, North African immigrants, scraped by, and every brushstroke for Isha was a scream against the suffocating silence of poverty. She dreamt in bold, unapologetic strokes, her work often deemed too raw or unrefined by those who mistook her lived experience for a lack of sophistication. Her citizenship, always a fragile thing, felt like a tether that could be cut at any moment. Then there was Chidi, meticulously ordered, almost an antidote to Isha's wildness. Son of a Nigerian French architect and a university lecturer, Chidi represented the striving middle class, a quiet ambition burnishing his every move. His canvases were intricate tapestries of urban life, rendered with a hyper-realism that demanded respect. He sought precision, a mastery of classical techniques infused with a modern sensibility. While he effortlessly navigated the social nuances of the French elite, he carried the invisible weight of expectation, not just his parents' pride, but the quiet, internal pressure to validate his family's sacrifices, to prove that his art was not merely a hobby, but a legitimate pursuit, worthy of the best. Sometimes a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in a critic's tone when discussing his work hinted at an underlying surprise at his unexpected command of European aesthetics. And finally Lena, a radiant, almost ethereal presence, her movements fluid, her attire subtly expensive, always perfectly understated. An African-American from a prominent family of philanthropists and academics in New York, Lena arrived with a different kind of burden, the assumption of effortless success. Her conceptual photography explored themes of identity and abstraction, challenging viewers to look beyond the obvious. She was articulate, poised, and immensely talented, yet she often felt the chill of being judged not for her art, but for her perceived privilege. Her work, though intellectually rigorous, was sometimes dismissed as lacking soul or too cerebral, as if her comfortable background precluded genuine emotion or struggle. She craved validation on her own terms, fiercely independent of her family's illustrious name. The internship was a pressure cooker masquerading as an idyllic summer retreat. Daily critiques were public gladiatorial contests, thinly veiled power plays. Friendships were flimsy constructs, ready to buckle under the weight of a dismissive comment or a coveted studio visit with a visiting master. Allegiances were not formed organically, they were strategic calculations. The other candidates were a kaleidoscope of nationalities and artistic temperaments. There was Julian, a pale, intense German, whose stark, minimalist sculptures were currently the darling of Professor Dubois, the stern, influential director of the program. There was Camila, a fiery Spaniard, whose vibrant, abstract expressionism was often pitted against Chidi's realism, a false dichotomy for the sake of critical debate. And then there were the others, a murmur of whispered conversations and sidelong glances, all keenly aware of the Ivy League prize. From the observer's vantage point, it was clear that Aisha, Chidi, and Lena, despite their vastly different backgrounds, were often lumped together. They were the others, the diverse candidates, a convenient block in the eyes of many. Julian, with a dismissive wave of his hand after a particularly brutal critique of Aisha's installation, had once muttered, "They're all just so earnest, aren't they? So much struggle." He hadn't meant it as a compliment to their resilience, but as a criticism of their perceived lack of sophistication or originality, a coded jab at their non-European perspectives. Their initial interactions were cautious, born more of proximity than genuine camaraderie. They shared knowing glances when an instructor praised a European artist's work as universally understood, while questioning the niche appeal of a piece that drew from non-Western traditions. They ate lunch together occasionally, a silent understanding passing between them, a recognition of shared experience, even if the fine print of that experience differed wildly. Aisha felt the constant struggle against the cost of materials, the pressure to produce without the luxury of experimentation. Her art was a visceral response to the struggles of her community, but here it was often met with a polite academic distance. Compelling, Professor Dubois would say, but perhaps a little didactic, a word that stung, suggesting a lack of subtlety, a bluntness unworthy of high art. She saw the ease with which Lena purchased new, expensive pigments, or Chidi leisurely refined a detail for days. A pang of envy, sharp and quick, would sometimes pierce her resolve. Chidi, for his part, found himself constantly code-switching, subtly adjusting his language and mannerisms to fit the expected decorum of the école. He watched his words, careful not to appear too passionate or too emotional, lest he fall into stereotypes. His precision, usually his strength, was at times perceived as a lack of spontaneity. He saw Aisha's raw power and Lena's intellectual depth, and sometimes wondered if his meticulousness was simply too safe, too derivative of the masters. He felt the need to prove that he wasn't just good for a black artist, but simply good. Lena, ever perceptive, felt the isolation of her privilege. Her peers, particularly those from European old money families, politely tolerated her, but rarely saw her as a true peer. They assumed her path was paved, her success predetermined. She saw their dismissive glances when she spoke about her family's work in social justice, as if her concerns were merely performative. She understood that her blackness was a factor, but her class muted the usual expressions of racism, twisting it into something more insidious, a form of condescension. She knew Aisha and Chidi faced a different, sharper edge of prejudice, and she wrestled with how to bridge that gap without appearing patronizing. She longed for connection, for someone to see her without the filters of race or wealth. The first major challenge was announced, a collaborative project culminating in an exhibition within a prestigious Parisian gallery, with the potential for GAFA scouts to be in attendance. The theme was identity in flux, intentionally broad, allowing for diverse interpretations. Groups were assigned randomly, designed to foster collaboration, but in truth, it was a crucible for conflict. Aisha found herself grouped with Julian and a quiet Japanese artist named Kenji. Julian immediately dominated, dismissing Aisha's ideas for a multimedia installation incorporating street sounds and found objects as too anarchic for the gallery space. He pushed for a minimalist, abstract piece, citing its universal appeal. Aisha bristled, feeling her voice silenced, her unique perspective undervalued. Chidi was paired with Camila and a French sculptor, Marc. Camila, fiery and opinionated, clashed with Chidi's methodical approach, calling him too rigid. Marc, while amiable, often deferred to Camila's more passionate vision, leaving Chidi feeling like a minority of one, his meticulously planned concepts sidelined. Lena was with two other American students, both white, both from backgrounds similar to hers. They approached the project with an easy confidence, their ideas flowing freely, their conversations punctuated by shared cultural references that Lena sometimes found herself alien to. Despite their shared nationality, she felt a subtle exclusion, a sense of being othered, even within her own cultural group, her race marking a subtle but definite boundary. The pressure mounted. Whispers of GAFA representatives attending the gallery opening amplified the tension. One evening, after a particularly draining critique where Professor Dubois had, quite subtly, praised Julian's intellectual rigor while characterizing Aisha's work as emotionally charged, perhaps a little raw for this setting, Aisha exploded in the shared studio. Raw? What does that even mean? She seethed, scrubbing furiously at a canvas. Because it doesn't look like their art? Because it's not clean and palatable? Chidi, who had been meticulously cleaning his brushes, looked up, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. It's coded language, Aisha. You know that. It's what they say when they don't want to say, it's not European enough, or it's too urban. Lena, who had been observing from a distance, walked over. They do it to me too. Too intellectual, lacking passion, Because a black woman can't be both, right? Can't be from privilege and still have something real to say. Her voice was soft, but the anger underneath was palpable. A fragile alliance began to form. They started sharing late-night coffee in cafes, discussing their struggles, the subtle slights, the overt dismissals. Aisha shared her struggles with obtaining quality materials, her fear of not being able to secure the right visa to study in the U.S. Lena offered to help her source materials, discreetly sending her a list of suppliers and offering to cover the cost, an offer Aisha grudgingly accepted, her pride battling with practical necessity. Chidi became their quiet analyst, dissecting the political dynamics of the studio, advising them on how to navigate the egos and biases. One particularly fraught week, a rumor began to circulate. Julian had been caught subtly altering one of Kenji's sculptures, shifting a delicate balance to make it appear unstable, less precise. Kenji, devastated, couldn't prove it, but the change was evident. The studio buzzed with hushed indignation. Aisha, enraged by the injustice, wanted to expose Julian. "It's sabotage. We have to say something." Chidi, ever pragmatic, shook his head. "And become targets? Julian has Dubois' ear. It would be our word against his, and they would see us as disruptive, not righteous." He knew the system too well. Lena, however, saw a different angle. What if we don't expose him directly, but we make sure the Gaffa scouts know the quality of his character, without accusing him outright? There are ways. Her suggestion was to subtly highlight the integrity of Kenji's original work in the gallery pamphlet and draw discreet attention to the subtle shift. It was a fine line. The gallery opening was a glittering, high-stakes affair. Champagne flowed, but the tension was electric. Gaffa representatives, identifiable by their crisp suits and discerning expressions, moved through the room, their notebooks discreetly open. Isha's piece, despite Julian's interference, conveyed a raw power. She had managed to rescue elements of her original vision, painting layers of her narrative onto the urban detritus Julian tolerated, creating a visceral contrast that caught the eye. Chidi's work, subtly infused with a new emotional depth he'd found by pushing back against Camila's dominance, resonated with a quiet strength. Lena's photography, stark and challenging, hung with an unsettling elegance, forcing viewers to confront their own preconceived notions. It was Lena who saw it first. Professor Dubois, animated and smiling, was cornering a Gaffa scout, gesturing animatedly towards Julian's piece. Lena overheard snippets. Such vision, truly exceptional, a future leader in the art world. Then, a sudden, cold dread washed over her as she heard her name. Dubois was mentioning her, but not in praise. Lena, of course, has a certain polished aesthetic, very American, but perhaps lacking the grit, the authenticity that true art demands. And Chidi, while technically proficient, can be a little derivative. As for Aisha, he paused, a slight, almost imperceptible curl of his lip. Her work is certainly passionate, but I fear she struggles with the academic rigor required for an institution of Gaffa's standing. Her background, you understand. He offered an apologetic shrug. Lena's blood ran cold. He had just decimated their chances, not with outright condemnation, but with the insidious poison of coded language and class-based discrimination, all under the guise of an honest assessment. She found Chidi, her face pale. "Dubois is sabotaging us, all of us. He just told the Gaffa rep that our work lacks authenticity, grit, or academic rigor because of our backgrounds." Chidi's jaw tightened. "I knew it. He plays favorites. Julian is his protege, the European ideal." Aisha arrived, her eyes blazing. She'd overheard a similar conversation, twisted words about cultural barriers impacting her narrative accessibility. "He wants Julian to get in. He wants to keep us out." The allegiances, once fragile, solidified in that moment of shared betrayal. But what could they do? The Gaffa reps were already leaving. The internship was almost over. It was Aisha, surprisingly, who found the opening. Later that evening, she saw Dubois and Julian deep in conversation, a celebratory air about them. Julian laughed, a little too loudly, and said, "It's all thanks to you, Professor. The Gaunt Fellowship will ensure my Gaffa tuition is covered." The Gaunt Fellowship. Lena's family foundation. A specific rare grant awarded only under particular circumstances, usually for artists from marginalized backgrounds or those facing significant financial hardship. Julian, from a wealthy German family, certainly did not qualify. The pieces clicked into place for Lena. Julian had used Dubois' influence and perhaps fabricated a story to secure a fellowship meant for someone like Aisha. Dubois was complicit. The choice was stark. They could expose Dubois and Julian, but that would mean risking their own GAFA applications, making themselves seem difficult, vengeful. Or they could remain silent, let Julian benefit from a stolen opportunity and hope for the best. "He's using the Gaunt Fellowship," Lena whispered, her voice tight with suppressed fury, to Chidi and Aisha. "My family's fellowship. It's for students who truly need it. Julian absolutely does not qualify, and Dubois signed off on it." Aisha felt a pang of despair. That fellowship could have been hers. A clear path for her, if not for GAFA, then for another prestigious school. The ultimate betrayal. Not just of their dreams, but of the very funds meant to level the playing field. Chidi, for once, abandoned his cautious pragmatism. That's fraud. That's outright corruption, not just bias. The three stood at a precipice. "If we say something," Aisha said, her voice trembling, "we might burn bridges. Not just here, but for GAFA too. They might see us as troublemakers." Lena met her gaze. "Or they might see us as people unwilling to tolerate injustice." The weight of her family's name, usually a burden, now felt like a weapon. They had influence. They had contacts. Chidi looked between them. He thought of his parents, their quiet sacrifices. He thought of the coded dismissals. He thought of Julian's smug superiority. "We have to say something, not just for us, but for everyone who comes after." The decision was made, not with fiery speeches and grand gestures, but with a silent, resolute nod between the three. It was a fragile alliance, forged in shared struggle, but solidified in the face of a direct, undeniable injustice. They would not be silenced. Not by class, not by race, not by perceived origin. The immediate aftermath of the Renoir Studio Intensive was not the triumphant announcement of GAFA acceptances. Instead, it was a maelstrom. Lena, using her family's connections, discreetly funneled the information about the fraudulent fellowship application to the GAFA admissions committee, and more subtly, to a few key art world journalists. Chidi provided meticulous, damning evidence of Dubois' preferential treatment from his careful observations. Aisha, with a raw, undeniable power, crafted a digital installation that wove together anonymous testimonies from other students about the studio's biased atmosphere, projecting it onto the very walls of the école in a clandestine, late-night act of artistic protest. The scandal erupted. Dubois was quickly put on administrative leave. An internal investigation launched. Julian's GAFA application and his fraudulent fellowship were immediately rescinded. The art world buzzed with the story, not just of the corruption, but of the three young artists who, despite their differences, had stood together. The Greenwich Academy of Fine Arts did not immediately send out acceptance letters. The process was thrown into disarray by the scandal. Yet, something shifted. The narrative, once controlled by biased gatekeepers, was now open, contested. Aisha, Chidi, and Lena stood at the brink of their artistic futures, the Parisian summer fading into an uncertain autumn. Their alliance had cost them the easy path, perhaps even complicated their individual journeys. But they had found something more profound, a voice, a collective strength, and the understanding that true excellence was not just about skill, but about integrity, and the courage to challenge systems that sought to diminish them. Their applications were still pending, their futures unwritten, but they had learned who they were, and crucially, with whom they truly belonged. The struggle for excellence, they realized, was not just about creating art, but about creating a space for their art to exist, authentically and unapologetically.